Hello and welcome to the Stapley Restoration Part 7. In this video I'm going to be starting the first stage varnish work on the bubble which I made in the previous video. So the first thing to do was just to get everything masked up. The only varnished parts on this boat are going to be the bubble, the dashboard and the two cockpit side runs that come off of that. The deck is going to be white, so you'll have a nice coloured wood comes down into the white lines of the deck. It should look pretty sharp, I think. So the first thing was to get that area masked off, and then I could begin the staining process. All the wood in this stage has been finished up to 180 grit by hand, just sanding with the grain so that there's no cross grain scratches or marks that are going to show up in the final finish. So then I started to apply the stain. If you saw any of my other videos on finishing, you'll know that I'm quite a fan of spirit-based stains. So I used the Morel's spirit-based light fast stain for this boat. This is actually a custom blended colour because the customer wanted quite a red sort of mahogany tone to it. I played around with a few different finishes and got something which is a nice sort of deep red colour, but also got that hint of mahogany as well. So I think it's going to be a really nice colour when it gets out in the sun and you've got the varnish built. That's when these types of colours really pop. So I think this is going to be a good one. Especially against the white that's going around the deck, it's going to look really sharp, I think. So this stain is just applied with a cloth. I just try and get the cloth as saturated as I can, and I just rub it on and work around the boat. Just keep going around the boat whilst it flashes off, removing any little marks, and pretty much just feed that wood as much as it's going to want to take. So the first three coats on this system are epoxy. It's 105 West System resin with the 207 special coating hardener. And this is just rolled on a couple of days after the spirit stain's on there so that it's had plenty of time to flash off and dry nicely. So the first coat is rolled on and then tipped off. Okay, so you'll notice that I've clothed that finish back off, and I thought just got a little bit of time just to explain why that is. So when you put the first finish on top of the colour, what it's going to do is it's going to lift a lot of that colour back out the wood, and although that doesn't necessarily look like it, you get a sort of pooling of the colour in that finish on the top. You might just be able to see that there. You get these kind of swirls of heavy colour where they're mixed in with the finish and not set in the wood, and that'll give you a bit of a patchy finish by the time you come up to full varnish level. So what I'm doing here is clothing it back off, so I've literally just got epoxy and colour in the wood grain and nothing sat on the top, and then as that dries that's going to lock that colour in, so the next coat will be able to build full thickness without having to do this. Particularly around areas like this where you've got a thick finish, you're going to get pools of colour collecting, and that's not what we want. So just aiming to get as much of that back off with the cloth as I can, and the result is this kind of satin looking finish to the wood, and that's what we're going to leave to dry. So I'll carry on with that before it sets up too much. So once that's clothed off, it's given a couple of hours just for the epoxy to start setting up, and as soon as it's starting to dry I go straight in with another coat. So that's rolled over the top of the first coat, and this time that's just left because we've locked that colour in now. I'm just wanting to build more of a volume, so there's one more coat straight on top of that, then a couple of hours wait, 2 or 3 hours, and then there's coat 3 that goes on top of that again. So we've got 3 coats of epoxy all applied in the same day, one on top of the next, just allowing the one before it a couple of hours for it to just set up a little bit. Then after a couple of days, when that's properly cured, I'm starting to flat that back. So I'm using a 320 grit on a flexible sanding block, and I'm actually wet sanding that. It just helps a little bit with any blush that you get in the epoxy. You only get a small amount of blush with the 207 hardener, which is quite nice, but it just helps with that, and it helps to just control the dust and stops you getting any sort of balling on the sandpaper. So it's quite a good approach that I find for flattening back fresh epoxy. So that was done with 320 grit paper, wet sanded, and then I've just gone over that with the Scotch-Brite just for any low areas that might not be quite keyed up properly. So I use a 320 grit Scotch-Brite pad, and I just go over that just to take the shine off of the rest of the surface before starting the next layer. Then it's a quick hoover off and tack cloth to get the surface ready for the first coats of varnish. So the varnish I'm using in the first instance is Epiphanes PP. That's the first time I've used this varnish actually, but it's a really good system. It's a two-part varnish, technically a two-part clear actually, so not what we would call traditional varnish really. But it sets up really quickly so you can build volume in quite a short space of time. You can actually apply 3 coats of this in a day, and after around an hour you'll find that it's starting to cure off, and you're getting that sort of masking tape consistency to the top finish of the varnish, which means you can then carry on building additional coats on top of that. Because it's a two-part system, you can build your coats nice and quickly and you've not got any issues with curing. So in the first instance I just did 1 coat with this. The only reason that wasn't 3 is because I had a power cut in the workshop. So I only got 1 coat on, and then we were out of action. By the time I could get back to it, it was too far cured. So I flatted that off just with a Scotch-Brite just to take the shine off of it and key the surface a little bit. And then I proceeded to build 3 more coats on top of that, one after the next. So it's the same process for cleanup again. I just go over the surface with a hoover with a little brush head on it, and then I tack cloth the whole surface. Go over that a couple of times before I start building varnish. So I used a combination of brush and roller technique on this to apply it. A brush around the dashboard area and the cockpit coaming, down the inside of the side runs that go down the cockpit. And then I go over to a roller and use that for the top faces of the cockpit side runs and across the bubble. And I'm just working from one side of the bubble to the next to try and keep my wet edge times as short as possible between stages. So on to the second coat of Epiphanes PP now. So this is applied around about 2 to 3 hours after the first coat. So as soon as that's cured up enough to give that masking tape consistency, all the solvents have evaporated out of it and it started to cure, we're on to the second coat. Epiphanes say that you can apply coats of PP anything from 24 to 48 hours after, without sanding in between. You can actually do it a little bit quicker than that, and I wanted to build volume a little bit quicker, so I'm doing 3 coats in a day here. So a couple of hours in between, then I'm straight on with the next. After the third top coat of that, we're then flattening down again. So it's 320 grit again, and this time I'm just dry sanding it. I'm using a flexible longboard sander for the bubble and down the side runs, and then a slightly smaller, thin sort of custom sanding block that I made just to get around the sides of the cockpit coaming. So that doesn't get flatted back too hard at this stage. We've not built a great deal of volume despite the fact the first 3 coats were epoxy. We've got the grain filled now, which the epoxy does very quickly in comparison to a normal varnish, but I don't want to go back too hard with it and risk breaking through that colour that I put on first. So it's just a bit of a light sand really with the 320 grit, just to get those first 3 coats keyed up and start to flatten them out a little bit. And then I'll build another 3 on top of that following on from it. So we're on to the final 3 coats now. Same process for cleanup again, just go over the boat with a hoover and then tack cloth the whole thing a couple of times. So you can see a bit of my process for roller in here. What I do is I try and load up the roller as evenly as I can, and then when I get to the boat I'll start applying it a slight distance away from the varnish that's already on there. And in that first roll I'll tend to gauge how much is actually on the roller, and from that I'll make a decision of which way to go. So if I've got a bit too much varnish on the roller, I'll work further away from the existing varnish. If I've got around about the right amount on there, I'll work back towards the varnish. That's just quite a good way of not getting too much concentrated where you don't need it. If you go straight in up the edge of the existing varnish, you can end up with too much on there and you're trying to spread it out. So I'm sort of subconsciously gauging things like that all the time. And that just helps to get a nice even lay on the surface quite quickly, without messing around with it too much. So that's pretty much the sum of the varnish finish for now. So we've got 3 coats of epoxy on there, and then we've got 7 coats of Epiphanes PP. So we've basically got a really good solid base built there now. The epoxy coats sort of equate to a lot more thickness in varnish. By the time you get to the 3rd epoxy coat, you've pretty much filled the grain. You wouldn't normally do that with varnish. You'd be up to sort of 8 or 9 coats probably before you get that done. So the fact I'm using a slightly different system here speeds up the process and means that you can build that volume a lot quicker. So that's it for the first stage of the varnishing process on the Stapler. The boat is now going to go into storage for a few months, and that will just give what we've got there the opportunity to harden up really nicely, settle down if it wants to at all, and the boat will come back out of storage in a few months' time. Then it'll get a really hard flat back, and we'll build the final coats, which will probably just be 3 coats of single pack Epiphanes to get a really nice finish on top of that base. If you're interested in learning more about the varnishing process, then I'm actually putting a course together which is going to be ready for enrolment in the near future. This course is going to be a bit more slow paced compared to my YouTube videos, so it's going to show you a lot more about the technique that I use, a lot more tips about maintaining wet edges and rollering methods versus brushing methods. We're going to cover surface preparation through bare wood and pre-existing finishes. We're going to cover the staining process and look at various different varnishes that can be used, both single part varnishes and also some different systems such as epoxy and the 2-part varnishes. Basically a complete method and more sort of guidance and advice on what system might be best for your application. If that's something that you might be interested in, then pop a comment below and let me know, because that'd be great to get some feedback on that. If you're not already subscribed, then make sure you hit that subscribe button, and as soon as the course is ready to launch, I'll be posting a video that tells you all about everything that comes included in with that course. So, hope you found that video useful. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers guys.